The Duke did not look at his wife. He looked at the house. Withercombe stood like a skeleton against the bruised twilight sky, its windows vacant as a skull's eyes. Rain began to fall, slicking the rotten leaves that choked the drive. It was a place where things came to be forgotten. That was precisely its purpose. He finally turned his gaze, not to her face, but to her hands, which were clasped tightly in her lap. Plain, gloveless, steady. "This is it," Gideon, Duke of Devereux, stated. It was not an announcement, but a verdict. Louisa looked past him, her own gaze fixed on the grim facade of the manor. She had known for a week that she was to be his wife. She had known for a day that he did not want her. Their wedding had been a transaction of state, a political alliance forged by his mother and her father to settle a border dispute and a significant debt. He had needed a duchess, but not a companion. He had needed a title settled, not a heart engaged. He had stood beside her at the altar, his jaw a line of granite, his responses clipped and cold. He was a man encased in grief for a first wife long dead, a fortress of a man no one dared assail. "There are no tenants," Louisa observed, her voice quiet but clear, betraying no tremor. "The fields are fallow." "That is correct." He reached into his coat and produced a purse heavy with coin, and a single large iron key, its surface a road map of rust. He did not place them in her hand. He set them on the worn velvet seat between them, a deliberate distance. "This is your allowance for the year, £500. It will be replenished annually. The key opens the front door. There is one servant remaining, a housekeeper. Her name is Hannah. She knows the terms." The terms. He did not need to state them. Be invisible. Be silent. Do not trouble me. Do not exist. She was a political necessity he intended to warehouse, and Withercombe was his chosen storeroom. Louisa looked at the key. It was a key to a prison, not a home. She understood this, but she also understood the alternative, a return to her father's house in disgrace, a burden to her family, a whispered failure. Between two prisons, she would at least choose the one she could command. She picked up the purse, its weight a solid, cold fact. Then she picked up the key. Her fingers closed around the cold, rough iron. "And you, Your Grace?" "I am returning to London," he said, his eyes already looking past her, toward the road back. "My affairs are there." The coach door was opened by a footman who took care not to meet her eye. The Duke dismounted, a tall, severe figure in the deepening gloom. He did not offer her a hand. He did not wait to see her enter the house. He simply gave a curt nod to the coachman, climbed onto his own waiting horse, and without a backward glance, rode away, disappearing into the rain and the night. The sound of his horse's hooves faded, leaving only the drumming of water on the carriage roof. Louisa sat for a full minute in the echoing silence. 1, 2, 3. She counted her breaths. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. They were a currency with no value. Instead, she tucked the key into her pocket, gathered the heavy purse, and opened the carriage door herself. The air that met her was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. The footman, looking miserable, had deposited her single trunk by the great weathered oak doors. He was already clambering back onto the carriage, eager to be gone. In moments, it too had rumbled away, leaving her utterly alone before the looming, dark mass of her new life. She walked to the door, the gravel crunching under her sensible boots. The key was stiff in the lock, groaning in protest. With a final, determined shove, the mechanism turned. The door swung inward on a long, complaining creak, opening into a hall of absolute blackness. A wave of cold, stagnant air washed over her, carrying the scent of dust and mice and time. From the depths of the darkness, a flicker of light appeared, a lone candle held in a trembling, age-spotted hand. It illuminated a face as weathered as the house itself, thin, pale, with eyes that held no welcome, only a weary resignation. "You'll be the new Duchess, then," the woman said, her voice a dry rasp. It was Hannah. "I am Louisa," she replied, stepping over the threshold and into the cold. "And you must be Hannah." The old housekeeper simply grunted, her gaze flickering over Louisa's plain traveling dress, her unadorned hair, her lack of a lady's maid. The assessment was swift and unflattering. "The Duke said you was comin'. Said you'd be stayin'." "Yes," Louisa said. "I will be staying." Hannah gestured with the candle toward a monstrous, shrouded staircase. "Master's suite is that way. Been shut up for 20 years. The damp's got in. Everything's got in." "Then I will not sleep there," Louisa stated calmly. "Which room has the soundest roof and a fireplace that draws?" The question seemed to surprise the old woman. She paused, thinking. "The old nursery, maybe. In the east wing. The slates have held there, mostly." "Then that is where I will be," Louisa said, her gaze sweeping the vast, ghost-filled hall. The furniture was draped in white shrouds, like a congregation of the dead. Cobwebs hung like macabre chandeliers. "We will start there." Hannah's expression did not change, but a new note entered her voice, a flicker of something other than exhausted apathy. "We?" "Yes," Louisa said, meeting the housekeeper's gaze directly in the faint, wavering candlelight. "You and I. We will begin with one room. We will make it clean. We will make it warm. And tomorrow, we will see about the rest." She set the heavy purse down on a dust-coated table, the thud echoing in the cavernous space. It was not a plea. It was not a request. It was a statement of fact. In the face of ruin, she would build. In the face of abandonment, she would endure. The Duke had left her in a tomb, but Louisa had no intention of being buried alive. 2 years passed. The silence of Withercombe was no longer absolute. It was punctuated now by the rhythmic clang of a hammer, the distant bleat of a sheep, the laughter of a child. The £500 a year was a pittance for an estate of this size, but Louisa, armed with a precise and frugal mind, had wielded it like a weapon against the decay. She had not spent a penny on herself. Her dresses were mended, her shoes worn. Every shilling was accounted for in a large, pristine ledger she kept in the now clean and dry estate office. Her first winter had been a brutal education in survival. She and Hannah had lived in 2 rooms, huddled by the nursery fire, eating from the stores of preserved vegetables Louisa found in the cellars. But in the spring, she had walked the estate. She had found more than just fallow fields. In a locked chest in the old steward's office, she had discovered the original charters for Withercombe. They revealed the estate was a trust, intended to provide land and livelihood for the families displaced by the great agricultural enclosures decades earlier. The Devereux Dukes had simply forgotten or ignored their duty. The estate was not just a private property, it was a public obligation. This knowledge became her foundation. She did not have the funds to hire laborers, so she offered something else. to a blacksmith's family from the nearby village of Marley. Homeless after a fire, she offered the abandoned smithy and a cottage with a leaking roof in exchange for his work. To a shepherd and his wife, she offered grazing rights on the overgrown hills in exchange for a share of the flock. To a handful of families, she offered small plots of land to farm, a roof in the disused stables and outbuildings, and a simple contract. Work for the good of Withycombe, and Withycombe will be your home. She called it the Withycombe Compact. It was not charity. It was a system of mutual benefit, built on her word and their sweat. Hannah, her initial skepticism long since melted away, had become her gruff, fiercely loyal second-in-command, managing the household stores and dispensing sharp-tongued wisdom. The people who came were desperate, but they were skilled. A weaver, a carpenter, a stonemason. They saw in Louisa not a distant, titled lady, but a woman who worked alongside them, her hands chapped from the lye soap she taught them to make, her brow furrowed in concentration as she designed a new system for guttering to catch rainwater. The great house was still mostly dormant, but its heart had begun to beat again. The east wing was now fully habitable, clean and bright. The vast kitchens, once the domain of spiders, now baked bread for 50 souls. The walled garden, which Louisa had cleared and tilled herself in that first lonely spring, now provided vegetables and herbs for the entire community. She had not created a village. She had allowed one to be reborn from the dust of a broken promise. She never wrote to the Duke. His bank in London received her meticulous expense reports, but he never acknowledged them. She was a ghost in his life, and he was a phantom in hers. She thought of him sometimes, a severe, handsome face, a man frozen in time. She wondered if he ever thought of her. She assumed not. Her purpose was to be forgotten, and she had given him no reason to remember her. Then, on a crisp autumn afternoon, he returned. There was no warning. A magnificent black coach bearing the Devereux crest appeared at the end of the drive, its path blocked by a cart laden with new slates for the west wing roof. A man on a fine black horse rode ahead of it. It was him. Louisa was standing on a ladder, her skirts hitched up, showing the sturdy boots beneath. She was demonstrating to the stonemason's son how to properly apply mortar to a crumbling section of the garden wall. Her hair was escaping its pins, and there was a smudge of lime on her cheek. She heard the commotion and turned, shielding her eyes against the sun. Gideon had reined in his horse, his expression unreadable. He was looking not at her, but at the scene around him. The neat, repaired cottages that had once been derelict stables. The smoke rising from the smithy's forge, the flock of sheep grazing on the hill where only brambles had grown. The clear, purposeful industry of a dozen people going about their work. He had left a ruin. He had returned to find a hamlet. His gaze finally settled on her, perched on the ladder. He saw the worn dress, the straying hair, the smudge of dirt. He saw the authority with which he spoke to the young man beside her, the respect in the boy's nod. This was not the pale, silent bride he had abandoned. This was a stranger. He dismounted, his movements stiff. He had not intended to stop. He was on his way north, a tedious but necessary tour of the regional militias on behalf of the Crown. A broken axle on his carriage had forced a detour to Marley for repairs, and a morbid curiosity he wouldn't admit to himself had prompted him to ride the extra 2 miles to Withycombe. He had expected to find the house in its final stages of collapse. He walked toward her, the silence stretching between them. The workers had stopped,
their eyes wide, sensing the tension. Louisa descended the ladder with practiced ease. She smoothed her skirts and faced him. She was no longer the frightened girl in the carriage. 2 years of sovereignty, however small, had given her a quiet confidence. "Your Grace," she said, her voice even. "An unexpected visit."
"My carriage requires repair," he said, his voice clipped. It was an explanation, not an apology. His eyes scanned the restored wall, the thriving garden beyond. "What is this?" "This is Withercombe," she replied simply. "Withercombe was derelict. I left it derelict." "You left it empty," she corrected him, a fine distinction that he did not miss. "It is not empty now. The terms of the estate's charter were quite clear. It had a purpose. I am fulfilling it." His jaw tightened. The charter. He had a vague recollection of his father's lawyers mentioning it, dismissing it as an archaic relic. He had never imagined anyone would actually read it, let alone act upon it. He looked from her steady face to the bustling activity around them. He saw order. He saw purpose. He saw value. It was an astonishing, infuriating discovery. He had intended to quarantine a problem, and she had somehow created a solution. "The repairs to my coach will take 2 days," he announced, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I will require lodging." Louisa nodded, unfazed. "The east wing is prepared. Hannah will show you to your rooms." She did not offer to escort him herself. She did not fuss or flutter. She had work to do. "If you will excuse me, Your Grace, the light is fading, and this mortar must set before the morning frost." She turned back to the wall, picked up her trowel, and resumed her instruction to the stonemason's son, as if the Duke of Devereux were nothing more than a passing traveler. Gideon stood frozen for a moment, an unfamiliar feeling churning within him. It was not anger. It was not admiration. It was a profound and unsettling sense of displacement. He was the master of this estate, and yet he felt like an intruder in his own home. For the first time in years, someone had not catered to his mood or title. She had simply continued her work. And he found himself, against all logic, wanting to see more. Gideon's stay at Withercombe extended from 2 days to 4. The local smith, a man who owed his livelihood to Louisa, was taking his time with the specialized axle repair, and the Duke did not press him. He spent those days in a state of quiet observation. He was a man who trusted evidence above all else, the hard data of ledgers, the verifiable testimony of witnesses, the cold logic of profit and loss. Charm was a currency he disdained, and emotion a variable he could not compute. What he saw at Withercombe was a mountain of evidence. He walked the grounds alone. He saw the new dam that created a mill pond, powering a grist mill that now ground flour for 3 villages. He saw the small schoolhouse where the weaver's wife taught 24 children to read and write. He saw the quarry, reopened, providing stone that was being used to restore the west wing of the great house itself. None of it was grand, but all of it was functional, sensible, and productive. On the 3rd day, he appeared at the door of the estate office. Louisa was at her desk, the famous ledger open before her. The room was simple: a sturdy table, 2 chairs, shelves filled with neatly labeled jars of seeds, and maps of the estate she had drawn by hand. "I wish to see the books," he said, without preamble. Louisa did not hesitate. She simply turned the large ledger around for him to view. Her handwriting was as clear and precise as her speech. Every penny of his allowance was accounted for. More than that, she had documented every transaction of barter, every agreement of labor, every yield from the fields. It was a perfect, crystalline record of a resurrected economy. He spent an hour bent over the pages, his silence absolute. He traced the lines of income and expenditure with a long finger. He saw how she had leveraged the sale of wool from her first small flock to buy the seed for 3 fields of barley. He saw how the profit from that barley had funded the repair of the mill. He saw how the mill's fees were now paying the stonemason's wages. It was a brilliant, self-sustaining system.
"You have a talent for this," he said finally, straightening up.
It was the closest he could come to a compliment. "I had a good tutor," Louisa replied, her gaze steady. "My mother managed a household of 40 on an income far less than what you provided. I paid attention." He looked at her then, truly looked at her. He saw the intelligence in her clear gray eyes, the quiet strength in the set of her jaw. He had married her for her name and her father's lands, a political pawn he had immediately discarded. He had never once considered the woman herself. He had assumed she was like all the other society ladies he knew, ornamental, frivolous, concerned only with silks and gossip. He had been profoundly wrong. The realization was as uncomfortable as a stone in his shoe. It was not pity he felt for her. He had pitied her on their wedding day, a plain, quiet girl sacrificed for family ambition. What he felt now was something harder, something a man like him understood better. It was respect. Before he departed on the 5th morning, his carriage finally repaired, he stood with her in the main hall. The shrouds were gone from the furniture in this part of the house. The wood shone with beeswax, and a vase of late-blooming asters from the garden sat on a polished table, a small, defiant splash of color. "The estate requires a proper budget," he stated, his tone as transactional as ever. "Your current allowance is insufficient for the scope of this enterprise." Louisa waited, her hands clasped loosely before her. "I will instruct my bank to place £10,000 at your disposal. You will continue to manage it. You will continue to send your reports." He paused, his gaze sweeping the hall. "This is a sound investment. I expect a return." It was a cold, businesslike arrangement. He was offering capital, not kindness. He was acknowledging her competence, not her worth. Yet, for Louisa, it was a victory more profound than any apology. He was not rescuing her. He was funding her. He was giving her the tools to build higher, faster. He was trusting her not as a wife, but as a partner in an enterprise. "The return will be self-evident, Your Grace," she said. "Withercombe will prosper." He gave a curt, single nod. "I do not doubt it." He turned and left, just as he had 2 years before. But this time, as his carriage pulled away, he looked back. He saw her standing in the open doorway, a solitary, determined figure framed against the backdrop of the life she was breathing back into the stone. And for the first time since his first wife's death, Gideon, Duke of Devereux, felt the ice around his heart crack, just a little. He had left a warden in his prison. He had returned to find an architect building a kingdom. And he was, to his own immense surprise, invested. With the Duke's capital, the transformation of Withercombe accelerated from a steady crawl to a confident stride. Louisa's meticulous plans, once constrained by shillings and pence, could now be realized. She hired more stonemasons from Marley to work on the main house, their ringing hammers a constant, cheerful percussion. The entire west wing was rendered habitable, its windows reglazed, its rooms aired out and furnished with simple, sturdy pieces built by the estate's own carpenter. The Withercombe Compact, as the community was now formally known, grew. Families who had heard of the just Duchess and her strange, thriving estate came seeking work and shelter. Louisa vetted each one carefully, looking not for deference, but for skill and a willingness to contribute. A tanner, a cooper, a woman skilled in herbal remedies. Each new arrival added another thread to the strengthening tapestry of the community. The population swelled to nearly 100 souls, and Withercombe became a name spoken with a kind of bewildered respect in the surrounding county. It was no longer a forgotten ruin. It was a local marvel. Louisa, in turn, was no longer just a manager.
She was a magistrate, a planner, a leader.
She settled disputes with quiet, impartial reason. She organized a harvest festival, the first in living memory, and the entire community celebrated in the great courtyard, their tables groaning with the fruits of their collective labor. She moved from her small room in the nursery to the proper Duchess's suite, not as an act of entitlement, but of practicality. It had the largest desk and the best light for her work. But light casts shadows, and the brighter the light from Withercombe, the longer the shadows it cast in London. News of the Duke's investment and the estate's miraculous revival reached the ears of the Dowager Duchess Theodosia. She was incandescent with fury. Withercombe was meant to be a silent, dignified cage for the inconvenient, plain-faced bride she had been forced to accept for her son. It was not meant to become a success story, and certainly not one authored by the girl herself. It made Gideon look foolish for abandoning it, and it made Louisa look formidable. The Dowager's chosen vessel for her displeasure was Lady Arabella Sinclair. Beautiful, polished, and possessing a tongue as sharp and slender as a stiletto, Arabella had been the woman everyone expected Gideon to marry once a respectable period of mourning for his first wife had passed. The sudden marriage to Louisa had been a shocking blow to her ambitions. Now, hearing that the drab little mouse was playing queen in the country, her resentment curdled into active malice. Arabella began her campaign subtly, in the drawing rooms of Mayfair. "Have you heard the most peculiar news from the north?" she would murmur to a circle of influential ladies. "It seems the new Duchess has a project, a colony of peasants. They say she lives among them like a common farmer's wife. Poor Gideon, so distracted by his grief, he allows her these little eccentricities. One does worry she might be overwhelmed, unstable even." The whispers spread like a contagion. The mad Duchess, the peasant queen, a woman unfit for her station. Having seeded the ground with rumor, Arabella decided it was time to inspect the crop. She wrote a letter to Louisa, dripping with feigned concern and sisterly affection, announcing her intention to visit Withercombe. "I am so longing to see the wonderful work you are doing, of which I have heard so much. I feel we must be the dearest of friends." Louisa read the letter with a cold sense of dread. She was a master of ledgers and logistics, not of social warfare. She understood numbers and stone and soil. She did not understand the intricate, venomous dance of high society. But she could not refuse. To do so would be to admit weakness. Lady Arabella arrived in a cloud of Parisian perfume and silk, her loveliness a stark, jarring contrast to Withercomb's rustic simplicity. She praised everything with a faint, condescending smile that never reached her eyes. "How charming! How rustic! And you, my dear Louisa, you look so healthy. Country life certainly agrees with you." For 3 days, Arabella trailed Louisa like a beautifully dressed predator, her compliments laced with poison, her questions designed to trip and expose. She spoke to the tenants, her voice syrupy with false sympathy, hinting that their contracts were unorthodox, their futures uncertain. She sowed doubt wherever she walked. The crisis came on the 3rd night. A cry of "Fire!" echoed from the east wing. A small one, confined to the estate office. It was extinguished quickly by a bucket brigade, but not before it had consumed a corner of the room. The air was thick with acrid smoke. Louisa's desk was scorched, a pile of quarterly reports reduced to feathery ash. And one of her ledgers, the one detailing the large cash expenditures for wages and materials, was badly burned along the spine, its pages fused by heat and water.
In the ensuing chaos, it was also discovered that a cash box containing £50 meant for the stonemason's weekly pay was missing. Louisa stood in the doorway of the ruined office, her heart a cold stone in her chest. It was too neat, too precise, an accident that served a perfect purpose. Hannah stood beside her, her face a grim mask. "That were no accident," the old housekeeper muttered, her eyes fixed on Lady Arabella, who was fluttering nearby, expressing her profound shock and horror. 2 days later, the Duke arrived. He had been summoned by an urgent, frantic letter from Arabella, describing a terrible fire, financial chaos, and a Duchess utterly overwhelmed and verging on collapse. He strode into the hall, his face a thundercloud. He had just come from London, where Arabella's rumors had reached him. He had dismissed them as spite, but her letter, combined with the sight of the scorched office doorway, gave them a horrifying new weight. He found Louisa in the office, trying to salvage what she could from the mess. Arabella was with her, wringing her hands and speaking in a low, concerned tone.
"Gideon, thank heavens you're here,"
Arabella cried, rushing to his side.
"It's been dreadful. Poor Louisa is beside herself. The fire, and now money is missing. She is so capable, of course, but perhaps this grand project has become too much for one person to bear alone."
Gideon's gaze fell on the damaged ledger, the missing cash box, the general disarray. He looked at Louisa's pale, soot-smudged face. For one terrible, fracturing moment, the old, cold doubt returned. The cynical belief that things fall apart, that people fail, that trust is a fool's game. His emotionally sealed nature, his reliance on cold, hard facts, saw only a scene of failure. The evidence before his eyes was one of chaos. He turned to his wife, his voice devoid of all warmth, cutting through Arabella's performance. "Explain this." Louisa looked up at him. She saw the suspicion in his eyes, the return of the cold, guarded man she had first met. She saw Arabella's triumphant, pitying smile. She could have wept. She could have protested, defended herself, accused her rival. But that was not her way. Begging was a language she did not speak. Instead, she straightened her shoulders, her expression clearing into one of calm, quiet resolve. She walked to a surviving bookshelf, took down the main ledger, the pristine, undamaged record of the entire estate, and 2 other account books. She carried them to the table where Gideon stood. She did not open them,
She simply placed them before him.
"The truth is in the numbers, Your Grace," she said, her voice quiet but unshakable. "As it always is. You are a man who values evidence. The evidence is there. Examine it." She met his gaze, and in her clear, gray eyes, he saw no fear, no guilt, no pleading. He saw only an unyielding, unimpeachable honesty. She was not asking for his trust. She was demanding his reason. And in that moment, the fate of Withercombe and of their fragile, unvoiced connection hung in the balance, dependent entirely on the cold, hard facts contained within the leather-bound books on the table. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. That night, Withercombe was silent. Lady Arabella had retired to her guest suite, confident in her victory. The tenants, unsettled by the fire and the Duke's forbidding presence, remained in their cottages. Louisa sat in her own rooms, not waiting, but working, redrawing the plans for the West Wing roof from memory. She would not allow herself to be paralyzed by uncertainty. She would continue her work until she was told to stop. In the estate office, by the light of a single, steady candelabra, Gideon worked. He did not delegate the task. He did it himself. For a man like him, truth was a fortress built of verifiable facts, and he would inspect every brick himself.
The room still smelled of smoke, a bitter reminder of the near disaster. He began with the main ledger, the one Louisa had placed before him. For hours, he sat in absolute stillness, his finger tracing the columns of figures. The book was a masterpiece of clarity. It told a story not of chaos, but of meticulous, brilliant order. He cross-referenced it with the Book of Labor Contracts and the records of crop yields. Everything matched. Every shilling was accounted for. The narrative of the numbers was irrefutable. Under Louisa's management, Withercombe was not just solvent, it was profoundly profitable. Then he turned his attention to the fire-damaged ledger, the one concerning cash expenditures. The edges were charred, the spine broken. But as he carefully separated the fused pages, a discrepancy caught his eye. The final entries, recorded on the day of the fire, were written in a hand that was subtly, almost imperceptibly different from Louisa's. The slant of the T was wrong. The loop of the G was too flamboyant. It was a forgery, a clumsy one, but designed to create confusion. He then examined the cash box itself, which had been recovered empty from a hedge near the office window. There were scratch marks around the lock, not from a key, but from a tool used to pry it open. Louisa had the only key. She wore it on a ring with the other estate keys, a practical chatelaine that jingled softly when she walked. She would have had no need to force the box. The pieces clicked into place in his mind, forming a picture of chilling clarity. The forged entries, the forced box, the convenient fire, the immediate, dramatic arrival of Arabella's letter. It was not a series of unfortunate events. It was a calculated act of sabotage. And there was only one person who stood to gain. A cold, quiet fury began to build in him. It was not the hot, explosive anger of his youth, but something far more dangerous. It was the icy rage of a man of logic who has seen the truth deliberately perverted. He had been manipulated. More importantly, Louisa had been assaulted. Her work, her reputation, her very character had been attacked with the vilest of weapons. The lie. His doubt, that flicker of cold suspicion he'd felt upon his arrival, now seemed a profound personal failing. She had met his accusation not with hysterics, but with evidence, trusting him to be the man he purported to be, a man of reason. And he had almost failed her. The thought was galling. His respect for her, already significant, solidified into something fierce and protective. He did not sleep. As the sun rose, casting pale light into the smoky room, he closed the final ledger. His course of action was set. A direct confrontation with Arabella would be her word against his. It would become a messy, private scandal. No. The attack on Louisa had been semi-public, built on rumor and insinuation. The vindication, therefore, must be absolute and witnessed by all. He would not merely defend his wife. He would place her beyond reproach, and he would use Arabella's own weapon, social standing, against her. Later that morning, he summoned Louisa and Lady Arabella to the drawing room. Arabella entered with a look of concerned sympathy, ready to console the Duke on his wife's failings. Louisa entered with her customary quiet dignity. Gideon did not look at Arabella. He addressed Louisa directly, his voice calm and clear. "Duchess, your management of this estate is exemplary. I find your records to be flawless." Arabella's smile faltered. "However," he continued, "this fire and the subsequent theft represent a grave insult to the honor of this house and its mistress. It requires a formal response. Therefore, I will be hosting a harvest ball here at Withercombe in 1 month's time. We will celebrate the estate's revival and formally present the year's accounts to our neighbors and tenants." He finally turned his gaze to Arabella, his eyes like chips of ice.
"I will be inviting the most prominent members of the county, including the Lord Lieutenant and the Chief Magistrate, Mr. Everett Crane. I trust, Lady Arabella, that you will honor us with your presence. It is important that all our friends are there to witness Withercombe's triumph over this unfortunate incident." It was not an invitation. It was a command, a summons. Arabella, trapped, could only accept, her face a mask of polite enthusiasm that did not quite conceal the flicker of panic in her eyes. She understood. He was not sweeping this under the rug. He was building a stage, and she, to her horror, had just been cast as one of the principal players. The month leading up to the harvest ball was a period of intense, focused activity. Gideon did not return to London. He stayed at Withercombe, a silent, watchful presence. He did not interfere with Louisa's daily running of the estate, but his support was a palpable force. When she needed more funds for the ball preparations, they were provided without question. When a merchant in Marley was reluctant to extend credit, a quiet word from the Duke's man of affairs resolved the matter instantly. They worked not as husband and wife, but as a silent, efficient partnership. Louisa, for her part, threw herself into the preparations. This was to be more than a party. It was the public unveiling of her life's work. She wanted the house not just to be grand, but to be authentic. The decorations were not expensive silks from London, but garlands of autumn leaves, wheat, and hops, woven by the estate's women. The food for the feast would come entirely from Withercombe's own fields, pastures, and gardens. The music would be provided by a trio of musicians from Marley. It would be a celebration of the place itself. As the day of the ball approached, an unspoken tension grew between her and Gideon. They spoke of logistics, of guest lists, of menus. They did not speak of the fire. They did not speak of Lady Arabella. They did not speak of the trust that had been broken and quietly reforged in the smoky estate office. Yet it was there, in the way he looked at her across the dinner table, his gaze lingering, analytical. It was there in the way she found herself listening for the sound of his footsteps in the hall. It was a fragile, unacknowledged thing, growing in the space between them.
The night of the harvest ball arrived, crisp and clear, with a sliver of moon in the sky. The great house, dark for a generation, was ablaze with light. Hundreds of candles glittered in the main hall and the newly restored ballroom, their light gleaming on polished floors and clean window panes. The scent of beeswax, wood smoke, and roasting meat filled the air. Carriages began to arrive, disgorging the county's gentry, their faces a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. They had all heard the rumors of the Mad Duchess and her peasant colony. They had come expecting to see a rustic farce. Instead, they found a house restored to its former glory, and a community of tenants, dressed in their clean, simple best, standing not as servants, but as proud residents, greeting guests alongside their duchess. Louisa stood at the head of the receiving line, beside the Duke. She wore a gown of deep blue velvet, a color that brought out the startling gray of her eyes. It was a dress she had made herself, its simple, elegant lines a statement of quiet confidence rather than fashionable display. On her belt, the iron ring with her keys, the original rusted one now joined by 24 new, gleaming brass ones, was the only ornament she wore. She was nervous, but she stood tall, her hand resting lightly on her husband's arm. Gideon was a formidable presence at her side. He greeted each guest with formal courtesy, but his attention was fixed on her. He saw the respect she was shown by her people. He saw the surprise on the faces of the gentry as they took in the scale of her achievement.
Lady Arabella Sinclair made her entrance late, as was her style, dressed in a dazzling gown of silver silk that seemed to shimmer with malevolent energy. She moved through the room like a queen, her smile bright, her eyes scanning the crowd, confident that this rustic affair would only serve to highlight her own sophistication and Louisa's inadequacy. She found Mr. Everett Crane, the county magistrate, a man known for his stern demeanor and sharp legal mind, and engaged him in conversation, doubtless planting more seeds of doubt about Withycombe's unconventional management. At 10 o'clock, when the ball was at its height, Gideon tapped a glass for silence. The music stopped. The chatter died down. Every eye turned to him. "My friends, my neighbors," he began, his voice carrying easily through the hall. "I thank you for joining us to celebrate Withycombe's harvest, but we are also here to address a matter of some gravity." A murmur went through the crowd. Lady Arabella, standing near the front, adopted an expression of solemn concern. "As many of you have heard," Gideon continued, "we recently suffered a small fire in our estate office, during which a sum of money was stolen. This event, coupled with certain rumors, has cast a shadow over our work here. I intend to dispel that shadow permanently." He gestured toward Louisa. "For 2 years, my wife, the Duchess, has single-handedly resurrected this estate from ruin. She has done so with a skill, an honesty, and a dedication that I have never before witnessed." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Her work speaks for itself. But as lies have been spoken, the truth must be given a voice." His gaze swept the room and settled on the magistrate. "Mr. Crane, as the chief legal authority in this county, I would ask you to witness what follows." Mr. Crane, his expression grimly intrigued, nodded. Gideon then produced a small, leather-bound book. "This is the household ledger, damaged in the fire. Forensic examination revealed the final entries, which suggested financial disarray, were forgeries." A gasp went through the room. Arabella's face went pale. "The cash box was not opened with a key," Gideon went on, his voice cold and precise. "It was pried open. And the fire was not an accident. It was set deliberately, using oil from a lamp. A stable boy, young Perkin, has given a sworn statement to Mr. Crane. He testifies that he was approached by a guest of this house,
who offered him 5 gold sovereigns to create a diversion near the office. The boy refused. He will now repeat his testimony. He nodded to a footman at the door. Young Perkin was escorted in, his face white with fear, but his eyes resolute. In a trembling voice, he recounted how a beautiful lady in a silk dress had tried to bribe him. When Mr. Crane asked him to identify the lady, the boy raised a shaking finger and pointed directly at Lady Arabella Sinclair. The collective intake of breath was like a rushing wind. Arabella stood frozen, her face a mask of horror. "This is absurd! A stable boy's fantasy! He is lying!" "Is he?" Gideon's voice was like the crack of a whip. "Then perhaps you can explain this." He held up a delicate, lace-edged handkerchief. "It was found beneath the office window, snagged on a rosebush. It smells faintly of Parisian perfume, and it bears the monogram A.S. All eyes turned to Arabella. She looked from the handkerchief to Gideon's merciless face, to the shocked and accusing expressions of the crowd. The stage he had built for her had become a pillory. There was no escape. Her reputation, her ambitions, her entire social existence crumbled to dust in that single, silent, terrible moment. With a choked sob, she turned and fled the ballroom, a pariah in the eyes of the very society she had sought to rule. In the stunned silence that followed, Gideon turned back to his wife. He did not touch her, but his eyes held hers.
In front of the entire county, he had not just defended her, he had championed her. He had used the cold, hard tools of evidence and logic, the very things he valued most, to build an unbreakable case for her honor. He had shown them all not the mad Duchess of Rumor, but Louisa of Withercombe, competent, honest, and utterly vindicated. Later that night, the last carriage had rumbled away, leaving behind the scent of snuffed candles and the quiet hum of a house settling into sleep. The victory had been absolute. The county was buzzing not with the old rumors, but with the new, astonishing truth of Lady Arabella's disgrace and the Duchess's triumph. Louisa, weary but unable to rest, had sought refuge in the one place that felt entirely her own, the walled garden. The moon was high now, casting the neat rows of dormant herbs and vegetables in silver and shadow. The air was cool and clean. She stood by the old stone wall she had first repaired, tracing the mortar lines with her finger. She heard his footsteps on the gravel path behind her. She did not turn. Gideon came to stand beside her, the silence stretching between them, no longer tense, but filled with a new, fragile weight. He was holding something in his hand. He held it out to her. It was the single, rusted iron key he had given her on that first, dreadful day. It looked small and insignificant in his palm. "This was a key to a prison," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of its usual ducal authority. It was the voice of a man speaking a difficult, unadorned truth. "It was a symbol of my blindness, my failure. I gave you a ruin and commanded you to disappear into it." Louisa looked from the key to his face. In the moonlight, the severe lines seemed softer. The fortress walls were down. "I was wrong," he said. It was a simple statement, but it carried the weight of years of pride and emotional solitude. Profoundly and completely wrong. He looked at her then, at the chatelaine of keys that hung from her waist. The keys to the storerooms, the kitchens, the office, the library, every part of the living, breathing house she had resurrected. "I left a duchess in a ruin," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before.
I returned to find a queen who had built a kingdom. He took a step closer, his gaze intense. I am not asking for your forgiveness. It is not mine to ask for. I am asking you to make a choice. Slowly, deliberately, he went down on one knee before her on the cold gravel path. A duke, kneeling to the wife he had discarded. He took her hand, his fingers warm and strong around hers. He did not look at her keys. He looked into her eyes. "Stay," he said, his voice raw with sincerity. "Stay at Withercombe, not as the Duchess of Devereux by title and by law, but as its heart, which you already are. Stay, not because you are bound to me, but because you choose to be. Stay with me, Louisa. Together." Louisa looked down at this proud, cold man, now brought to his knees not by defeat, but by a revelation. He was not offering her a pretty apology. He was offering her a partnership. He was offering her a choice, the one thing she had never been given. He was not rescuing her. He was finally, truly seeing her. Tears she hadn't shed in years pricked at the back of her eyes, but she did not let them fall. She simply tightened her hand around his. "Yes," she said. Her voice was as clear and steady as it had been on the day she arrived. "Plainly, yes." He rose, his hand still holding hers, and in the quiet of the moonlit garden, surrounded by the fruits of her labor, he gently drew her forward and, for the first time, kissed his wife. It was not a kiss of passion, but of recognition. A promise sealed not with a vow, but with a simple, profound truth. Together. 2 years later, Withercombe was a name known throughout England, not as a ducal seat, but as a model of what a community could be. The Withercombe Compact was studied by landowners and parliamentarians, a testament to what could be achieved when duty was remembered and people were valued. The village had grown, with a proper chapel and an infirmary, all built from the estate's own profits. On a bright summer morning, Gideon and Louisa walked hand in hand through the bustling lane that led from the main house to the cluster of cottages. Children, released from the now expanded school, waved as they passed, calling out their names without deference, but with genuine affection. A young man, the stonemason's son she had once taught, tipped his hat. He was now the master mason for the entire estate. They paused on the crest of a small hill, looking down at the thriving landscape. The fields were green and gold, the cottages neat with smoking chimneys, the great house standing not as a symbol of power, but as the steady heart of it all. A carriage was making its way up the drive. Louisa recognized it as belonging to her family. Her younger sister, Philippa, was visiting. The first visit, a year ago, had been awkward, filled with Philippa's shallow pity for Louisa's rustic life. But something in Withercombe's quiet dignity had humbled her. Now she came not to judge, but to learn, bringing her own children to experience a place where work had meaning and life was genuine. It was not a perfect reconciliation, but it was a real one. That evening, after a simple dinner with her sister, Louisa walked through the quiet house, performing the nightly ritual of locking the doors. The great hall was peaceful, the moonlight streaming through the tall windows, illuminating the polished wood and the vase of Withercombe roses on the central table. She came to the main doors, the last to be secured. She selected a large brass key from the chatelaine at her waist. The collection of keys, which had grown with every restored room and rebuilt cottage, now made a soft, melodic jingle as she moved,
a sound that had become the music of her life. As she turned the key in the lock, she felt a warmth at her back. Gideon had come to stand behind her. He placed his hands on her shoulders, his chin resting lightly on her head. He didn't speak, but simply stood with her, looking out the glass panels of the door at the moonlit land they now tended together. He watched her hand as she gave the key its final turn, the solid, satisfying click echoing in the hall. The sound of security, of home. His gaze fell to the chatelaine, the gleaming cluster of brass and iron, a map of her accomplishments. He reached down, and his fingers gently closed over hers, still resting on the key. The rusted iron one was still there, nestled amongst the new. A reminder of the beginning, a testament to the journey. "Everything is secure," she said softly. "Yes," he replied, his voice a low murmur against her hair. He tightened his grip on her hand, a simple, solid affirmation of all they had built, all they had become. Together. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.